One might have all of the seeming accolades and all of the seeming identity metrics that should constitute belonging in a space, but might still feel like they do not belong at all. Thankfully, a lot of people told me that I was good and I started to believe them, but I didn't have this innate drive that a lot of my other teammates had. And I realized that could only get me so far. I think in many ways my friends are my mentors because they are doing this journey with me, but I had a modicum of hope, and I figured if I don't try, then I'm gonna look back at this moment in my life and think, wow, what would have happened if you had tried?
Hi, it's Ekezie. Welcome to Limitless. In this series, we spotlight the most incredible young people from across the world who are pushing boundaries and inspiring excellence. You're definitely in the right place if you're a young person who is looking to defy the boxes that have been placed on you by yourself and by other people. Here, we believe that your potential is truly limitless. Please like this video and subscribe if you enjoyed it to see more. Now, let's get into the video. Awesome. Isaiah, thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate you making the time and just gracing us with your presence today. I'm very excited for our conversation because you have a very interesting background, and we're going to dive into that in a second. But I wrote this down. You're a polymath. You describe yourself as that, but even beyond describing yourself as that, you embody that in very many ways. You're currently studying towards your PhD at Oxford. And on top of that, I wrote this down. You're a writer, a poet, speaker, experience designer, model, assistant professor, curator, art director, and brand strategist. You've worked with organizations in different fields. I saw Adobe. I know you worked at Airbnb when you were in the US, the NHS, the royal family. At the core of all of this, who is Isaiah? How do you introduce yourself?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on your podcast and on your show. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be here.
Of course.
To know that I'm joining a stellar roster of incredibly inspiring, mission-driven people, so I don't take this invitation like
Absolutely.
lightly. Thank you so much. So I actually describe myself as polymathic, as opposed to polymath. And so I see polymathic as, I suppose, reminiscent of the journey that I'm on, as opposed to the place where I've landed. I think polymaths are people who have long gone and, carved out an amazing legacy for themselves, whereas I'm, just at the very beginning of that journey. So for me, it's more about being polymathic and being open and receptive to the various ways my interests can weave together, and also tell different kinds of stories. So whether that's as a designer at Airbnb, looking at how to carve out a platform where people can feel a sense of belonging, all the way through to my PhD, which I suppose is kind of following a similar thread, all the way through to reimagining what education could look like for the future generation of students. And so I see polymathic principles baked into everything that I do. And to your question, who is Isaiah? Who is at the core of Isaiah? I think that's a question I will continue to ask myself. And I think at the heart of that question and at the heart of the answer is probably someone who is deeply empathetic, sometimes to a fault, and someone who is deeply curious and who asks more questions than there are answers to. And I think it's kind of those three things: curiosity, empathy, and a willingness to pose and reflect, and then ask questions that perhaps others haven't considered or others are scared to consider. And so I'd say those three things are at the core of me. I'd also say there's, alongside those things is also kindness and joy and gratitude, and a real focus on giving forward. I say giving forward as opposed to giving back because I believe that when we think about giving back, we often think about the people we are giving to being behind us, when actually what if those people are in front of us and are the ones we want to continue to run the race ahead. So I believe in giving forward, and I believe that when we give forward, we perhaps give our best and give the things that we otherwise would hold on to.
That's very rich. So you think of being polymathic as a process versus the outcome and a definition of who you are right now and where you are now.
Yeah.
You think of it as principles that help you guide you on your journey. In that vein, how do you decide what questions? Because one of the things you mentioned is you think about questions that most people would ignore. How do you decide what questions are worth thinking about? Is there some sort of framework you use, and how long do you hold on to these questions for?
There isn't a framework. Frameworks actually really, I struggle with frameworks, to be honest, because I think as soon as you have a framework, even though in my job I come up with frameworks, but I also then
I was gonna say,
I use the framework as something I can then kind of break. And so I think frameworks are only helpful if there's room to break them. And I'm very open with my team about that too. Like, what I offer in my frameworks is a guide, not necessarily a rule book. And so I don't really think in terms of frameworks. Or if I do, I think in terms of what could sit outside of the framework and what am I missing and what perhaps am I losing sight of because I'm already thinking from a very narrow perspective. How do I decide what kinds of questions to hold on to?
Versus what questions to let go of, for example.
One question I've been thinking about a lot, given the current socio-geopolitical context in the world, is how might it be possible to hold multiple things true? And I think our society can often force us to be very binary or to choose sides. And I think we can often lose sight of so many nuances and perspectives when we are forced to sit on either side of the camp. And I think I understand why those camps exist. And I understand why people are drawn to sit on either side of the camp. And I understand why there's a reticence or even a suspicion towards those who sit on the middle. I suppose one thing I've been thinking about is how might it be possible to simultaneously in the context of the Israel-Palestine war, is it okay if I?
Of course, go ahead.
In the context of the Israel-Palestine war, could it be possible to share your condolences towards those who were murdered on the October 7th attacks in Israel, while also sharing your condolences towards those who are continuously being killed and murdered in Palestine, while also sharing your condolences for those who, or your hopes for those who are being held hostage. And one of the things that I really struggle with when it comes to talking about politics is it often feels like if you you're only allowed to subscribe to one of those or maybe two of those. And if you subscribe to more of them, then, well, there isn't really room for you. And I find that really difficult. And I think part of my role is, as an academic at the London Interdisciplinary School, and even in my PhD, is to hold space for multiple things to potentially be true and to explore things from various perspectives while not playing devil's advocate. I don't believe in devil's advocate. I don't think that's helpful. I think it allows people to not be held accountable for their perspectives. While saying that, I do think it's important for us to consider what perspectives we are losing as a result of having perhaps more narrow stances on the topic. And that's just one example. And I think just with the few conversations I've had this week with friends who are raising money at encampments across different universities, or perhaps even in Hackney, all the way through to friends who are Israeli Jewish and who have very different perspectives on the war. I've learned that if you were to just listen to one of those perspectives, you could very easily be like all in.
Yeah.
And I think it's incredibly challenging to hold space for both of those or multiple perspectives at the same time. I think that is the level of cognitive dissonance that creates is quite, or the potential for the cognitive dissonance is quite scary and intense. And I've been thinking a lot, back to your question, of what might it mean for us to have a culture and a society and to carve out spaces where we can hold multiple things to be true.
And that's the primary subject of not just your research with your PhD, but it's a theme that has run through most of the work you've done, which is this concept of belonging. And I found that to be very interesting. What's the problem statement here? What's the belonging problem that as as a global society we experience today?
So my research originally wanted to look at what might it mean for people who have historically been marginalized from different spaces to feel a sense of belonging once they enter these spaces. And I was specifically interested in elite higher education institutions such as Oxford. I was originally interested in Oxford because until the late 19th century, Oxford was considered part of the British state alongside the monarchy, the House of Parliament, and the Church of England. And so it seemed quite fascinating that an institution that has played such a big role in shaping British politics, culture, and values might also be an institution where one could learn a lot about what kinds of practices exist at the university that either help to facilitate or perhaps even hinder one's sense of belonging. And so that was the original idea, and that in many ways was shaped by my undergrad research that looked at the kind of tension between cultivated agency and systematic oppression. So how might one cultivate a sense of agency and kind of level up through self-empowerment and through studying at, elite universities and through working at prestigious jobs or prestigious companies, while also wrestling with forms of systematic oppression, whether that be sexism, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, ableism, just to give a few examples. And I was really interested in how agency interacts with systematic oppression. And thankfully, I was able to go straight from undergrad to PhD and pursue this topic further. So to answer your question, belonging for me is quite a nebulous topic. It's quite difficult to define. And I mean, I'm in the third of my PhD now and I still can't really define it. At its core, I think it's about comfort and safety and a need to be seen and a need to be understood on your own terms. And those are the rough kind of vernacular I'm using at the moment to make sense of the topic. And I mentioned the kind of origins of the research topic, but I'm now looking at what might it mean for different groups to cultivate a sense of belonging. So not only those who were previously marginalized and excluded from Oxford, but also those who are perhaps legacy students, those whose families have gone to Oxford, those whose families or whose schools are renowned for sending students to Oxford. And I'm interested in multiple narratives and multiple experiences. I think some of my early insight and research has shown me that belonging is relational. So there isn't kind of an absolute sense of belonging and an absolute sense of non-belonging. One might have all of the seeming accolades and all of the seeming identity metrics that should constitute belonging in a space, but might still feel like they do not belong at all. And I'm interested in why that's the case and who actually belongs. I think that's a cool question I'm asking throughout my PhD. Like, if Oxford is a place where some people belong and some people don't, yet those who feel that they should belong don't belong, then who actually belongs? And that's a cool question. And I think, linking back to what I mentioned earlier, it's important for us to consider these various perspectives when we consider the huge topic of belonging, because otherwise we risk alienating or even minimizing some people's experience because we haven't lended the time of the ear to listen to their perspective.
Yeah.
Which, again, I think is very difficult and can be very challenging, and I'm not saying it's easy at all. And I suppose that's why I'm doing the PhD, because I'm somewhat committed to, and I say somewhat because it is very challenging, I'm committed to trying to understand the various perspectives and trying to confront my own prejudices and biases throughout this process.
Yeah. One very interesting thing you identify, which I want us to talk a little bit more about, is where are young people, for example, who experience, ageism primarily, and depending on exactly where you fall, there's probably more, labels. Where are they best served? Are they best served rising up and, fighting this entrenched interest, this in the establishment, as it were, that in many ways disadvantages them, or like you say, leveling up through self-empowerment? And I know there's a world where they can pursue both, but practically, do you think that's difficult? And if they had to choose from your experience, what should young people be doing?
If I've understood your question, are you saying should young people either pursue kind of agency or pursue fighting oppression?
Yeah. I guess which of these routes leads to an outcome that's better for the world?
I can't really give a blanket response to that because I'm conscious that so many of the people watching this video will have so many different contexts and might be coming from so many different countries, let alone cities. And even within those cities, there might be different kinds of politics, different kinds of privilege, different kinds of socioeconomic challenges that might make one route easier than the other. I can speak from my context and my specific lived experience, and I think what has helped me the most has been focusing more on what I can control.
Yeah.
And for example, during the 2020 wave of Black Lives Matter protests, I decided to use my dissertation as my protest. And that felt like the only thing I could control. I could control the words that I articulated on the page. I could control the energy and the depth of reading that I engaged with. And I could control how I represented the different kind of participants who featured in my work. And I could also control the conclusions that I drew, right? And I decided that there are different ways to protest. And thankfully, we live in a society where people can protest and people can use their right to protest. And I decided that my form of protest would be my dissertation, and I would get out all of my anger and frustration and even resentment in my words. And I then translated a lot of pain and anger into forms of catharsis. And that piece of work has then translated into my PhD.
Yeah.
And I get to see the fruit of my protest directly through my interactions with students who I work with daily. I get to see the fruit of my work in the kinds of projects I get to do. For example, a book project I worked on for 2.5 years. That's currently been rolled out to students across the UK, predominantly those who go to state schools.
Yeah.
I get to see the fruit of that protest through the kinds of projects I can say yes to and the ones that I can say no to, through the kinds of policies, and even through to the way that I can interact with prospective students who want to work with me, or even in terms of the talks that I give to young people who are on at an earlier stage in their journey and are applying to university or finishing their A-levels. And I see that as my protest. So to answer your question, I think in my context, I pay more attention to the things that I can control. Yes, systematic oppression exists in various forms. I attempt to tackle systematic oppression through paying attention to what I can control, and what I can control is the kind of work that I do, the kind of people I interact with, and hopefully the sense of hope and joy that I can leave people with once I've interacted with them.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Let's come, to you just a little bit more. A few years ago, I think 4, 5, 6 years ago, you embarked on a crowdfunding campaign to go to Harvard, and I think that's actually when I found out about you. And I know you've probably talked about this a lot, but how was that experience for you? Let's start with, why did you decide to go that route? What were the situations surrounding that? I know you lost the scholarship that you were supposed to get, and but you were committed to going to Harvard ultimately.
Yeah. Oh, I can't believe that was like 7 years ago.
7 years now.
That is, I'm going to say the time has gone by at the right pace. Okay, so what were the circumstances? I was in the second year of my undergraduate degree at UCL, where I was studying anthropology, which I really loved. And I think, going back to my earlier point in terms of what is at the core of Isaiah, the core, consists of curiosity. And so I was curious to know what it might be like for me to carve my own path and weave parts of a US education into my undergraduate degree. UCL didn't have a partnership with Harvard at the time. And I wondered whether I could still study there in some capacity. I grew up playing basketball, and so studying in the US was always on my radar.
Yeah.
And I traveled to the States nearly 2 or 3 times a year for different kind of invitational basketball camps.
Yeah.
So in an alternative universe, there was a scenario where I played basketball for, Division I college.
Yeah.
But in this universe, I knew that I didn't care that much about basketball to invest my whole life in it. And I had friends who I played with, who I went to basketball camps with, who now play in the NBA. And there was always a difference between us. Like, I played because, thankfully, a lot of people told me that I was good, and I started to believe them. But I didn't have this innate drive that a lot of my other teammates had. And I realized that could only get me so far. But I did have that innate drive for education. And so in our universe, when I thought about how I wanted to study and make the most out of my undergraduate degree, studying at Harvard felt like a no-brainer, or at least the option to pursue it felt like a no-brainer. So there's a whole kind of middle part, but I'll just say I managed to convince a key stakeholder at UCL to support me, and she was amazing. And we submitted my very long application. I then secured a scholarship from a private charity, and that scholarship would have funded my entire time at Harvard. And then 2 days before I got my offer from Harvard, I received a note saying that, unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, the scholarship had been withdrawn because of some financial challenges. And I remember reading it and thinking, I'm not entirely sure how I'm supposed to process this, but who knows, maybe I won't get in anyway, and so maybe I won't have lost anything. And then I found out 2 days later that I got in. And so that whole season was like such a whirlwind of emotions. And I remember it was May 2017. I was on the cusp of starting my internship at JP Morgan. And I was also on the cusp of figuring out whether I had the energy to raise, or I suppose explore, alternative funding options. And I decided to pursue both, do my internship, knowing that it would drain every ounce of energy I had, both weekday energy and weekend energy, while also trying to raise £64,000 in 4 weeks. And yeah, my really close friends rallied behind me. I created a small team and we strategized, and yeah, I suppose pre-TikTok days, like raised the full amount, largely on Facebook.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
I think we raised like half of it on Facebook. I think I raised like £20 on LinkedIn. But every little
ironic, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, so many people were like, oh, LinkedIn will be the space.
Yeah.
It wasn't the space.
Yeah.
But yeah, thankfully I raised the full amount, and that funded my time at Harvard. And I remember finishing my internship and having like 4 days to pack up all of my stuff and then fly to Boston. And I just got to Harvard and I was like, okay, now I want to rest because I've just finished this crazy internship. I've also just finished this campaign. I've got 800 people waiting for like an update. Plus I've got these new friends that I need to make.
Yeah.
Organizations are recruiting already. I need to figure out what classes I'm taking. I need to get a phone.
Wow, yeah. You know, the big things and the small things.
Yeah, I was so overwhelmed. And I felt like I could have just paused time so that I could catch up with my body. And obviously I couldn't, so I just had to take everything in my stride. But yeah, that year changed, shaped, enhanced, elevated, crushed me in every way you could imagine. But I think I'm much more resilient and much more thoughtful and purposeful as a result of that year. And although it was a year, it felt like 4 years cramped into one.
I'm sure. Were you afraid of rejection when you decided to embark on this campaign? Were you afraid you just put yourself out there and there, you know, no one will bite?
Interestingly, I wasn't. I wasn't scared of rejection.
Did you even think about it, the possibility of that?
Probably, but not enough for it to put me off.
You were just sure, like, I'm going to raise £64,000, like, on Facebook.
I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
But I had a modicum of hope. And I figured if I don't try, then I'm going to look back at this moment in my life and think, wow, what would have happened if you had tried?
Yeah.
And I think I was more fearful of that. I was more fearful of my future self looking back on that moment and thinking, wow, you didn't even give it didn't even give it a shot. Like, how dare you, you know? And I can look back at my 2017 self and say, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for giving it a shot.
Do you think that's something you do in other areas of your life, and that's something more young people should do? Take the bull by the horn, you know, give it your best. There's a high chance you'll fail, but in that very slim off chance that you succeed, you'll be so grateful that you tried.
Yeah, I think that should be, if it's within your remit, I think giving everything your best shot should be your go-to strategy, because otherwise you will live in the what ifs.
Yeah.
And going back to what I mentioned before, I try and control everything that is within my remit. I can't control if people will donate, but I can perhaps control how many opportunities I give them to donate, or how many opportunities I give them to engage with my content, or I can try and preempt the questions and worries they might have and therefore respond to them. Or I can reach out to different organizations and see if I can do an interview so that I have more reach. I, again, can't control people who donate though. So going back to that point, as long as you do everything within your remit, I think you've given it your best shot.
Yeah.
And therefore, there's no room for regrets, no room for what ifs, no room for next time. You did all you could within that context, and I think you should be proud. And I also think I wasn't kind of obsessed with getting in. Well, I'd already got in, but I was so focused on raising the money that I wasn't even thinking about what Harvard would look like once I got there. And so I was just very present, and I think living in that present moment allowed me to make the most out of the experience.
That makes sense. Let's talk about mentors. Do you have
Yeah.
any mentors?
Yes, I do. I have mentors, and I think one caveat to that is I found it a bit difficult to know what kind of people I want to mentor me.
That was what I was going to ask,
Yeah.
how you make that decision for who you want to be a mentor, and even how you get them to mentor you. Do you ask?
Yeah, it's been really challenging. I think when I was younger, it was a lot easier because I was just trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I had so many interests, and I think a lot of the people I met were skeptical that I could pursue my various interests at the same time. So they kindly and respectfully tried to discourage me from pursuing different interests simultaneously. For example, one mentor would say, just pursue investment banking, or one mentor would say, just pursue academia, or one mentor would say, just focus on your undergrad, don't think about your career. And I think,
Yeah, what do you do now? Yeah.
I understand where they're coming from, but also this is not the best advice for me. So I think one of the key things when it comes to mentors is knowing that they are just sharing from their lived experience.
Yeah.
And you, as a mentee, have the option to take and leave whatever is useful / not useful. And in my current context, and it's something I think about a lot, I find it difficult to have mentors who can fully understand and appreciate and empathize with the current path I'm on, because a lot of them don't do the kind of work that I do.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I find it hard. I think in many ways my friends are my mentors.
Yeah, why?
Because they are doing this journey with me, and, like George, for example, is someone that I can talk to every day, multiple times a day, and just pose questions to and run something by. And, if I'm unsure of something, we'll just carve out space to problem solve it or troubleshoot it, whether that's like a proposal for a client, or a talk that I'm giving, or a project or talk that he's giving. And I think for me, that allows the relationship to be much more dynamic, whereas I think sometimes mentor-mentee relationships in the traditional sense, where it's someone who is much more senior in their career talking to someone who is much more junior, I think this kind of dynamic allows for more curiosity and humility, and less like, oh, this is the path you should take because I did something similar. And also, why does that path seem like the most appropriate one for you? And I think the kind of bond we have relies on being friends for 10 years. And, I think George will have very different views on this because he has different kinds of mentors who he has known for a very long time, who can speak to different parts of his life. And I think that works for him. And I think that also works for some of my other friends. I think in my context, I find it much more difficult because I am so mindful of the intention behind the advice.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that's just my experience of it.
Yeah. So what you're saying is you found your friends to be very reliable mentors because beyond just career and that sort of straight-jacketed understanding of this is what you should do because I did this and this is what I see other people do, they understand who you are holistically and sort of where you're trying to go.
Exactly.
And can support you. That makes a lot of sense. But for, on this subject, because that's a question that I'm sure you get asked a lot, how do I find mentors? I think, you've had the opportunity to be a part of programs that have provided mentors. You're very well known, so I'm sure a lot of mentors gravitate towards you. But for someone who is out there who doesn't have the opportunity to be a part of these programs or to go to great schools, how do they find that one mentor? What advice do you have for them?
My mantra is create a space where serendipity can thrive. And I think that kind of goes back to how George and I met. We met at the Palace of Westminster 10 years ago when George's brother Kenny received an award, and George and I just got chatting at the back of the room during one of the kind of breaks, and we just realized we had so much in common, but also such different lived experiences. And I think there was a real curiosity in wanting to understand the other person's lived experience. And so how that might translate to someone else is to put yourself in places where there's a potential for you to be surrounded by people who you might end up doing life with. Those could be people who share similar interests, whether it's in art or tech or fashion, or whether it's people who are studying a similar subject to you, or have a similar faith to you, or play similar sport. And I think those environments can sow the seeds that then blossom into friendship/mentorship.
I guess my final question for you is, who does Isaiah want to be when he grows up?
Who does Isaiah want to be when he grows up? Curious, empathetic, and thoughtful. And I suppose, I want to be on the next, I want to be at level X of that. So say I'm at level 28 now. I want to be on whatever level is next in that journey. I also think I want to carve out more time for joy. I think I do enough of that right now, but...
What does that mean, practically?
Yeah, practically. What does it mean? I've recently started going to raves alone. And I love it. I really love it. I love it because, I'm used to going to raves with lots of friends and bumping into lots of friends there. And that's great, and that feels lovely, and it feels nice to feel that level of safety in a group. But I'm also like, if I want to meet people who are on a similar wavelength to me and who are courageous and brave and who are empathetic and thoughtful, I imagine that they're also going to raves alone too. And so I, in a way, want to find more of my tribe, and I want to find more of my tribe in spaces that can create joy. And I went to a rave a few weeks ago, and I was in the queue reading my book.
The calm before the storm.
And I thought, I don't really have that. I'm not going to talk to anyone until I get past the gates. But then someone came and stood next to me, and we just started chatting about the book I was reading. And it was so cool to just have that interaction. And we bumped into each other at different points in the rave, and I just thought, yes.
It's working. The experiment is working.
This is what I want. It brought me a lot of joy to have those serendipitous encounters. I think serendipity brings me a lot of joy. Serendipity brings me a lot of joy, and I think one of the only ways you can carve out serendipity is when you are in control of what you do, which sounds counterintuitive because serendipity also relies on a lack of control. But I think you are much more open to things, to chance, when there is no agenda.
Isaiah, thank you so much for the conversation and for bearing your heart open. I really enjoyed this, and I'm sure everyone who's watching this will find so much meaning from listening to your story. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course.